Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. We are kicking off another Spies and Resistance week with a super show about women, spies, and partisans. Today, I'm joined by two historians, Dr. JoAnna McDonald from the States, and to co-host with me, Dr. Kate Vigers. And they are the authors of these books I'm holding up now. One I've had for a long time. This one. I'm forgetting which hand I'm in, and this one I've had a bit more recently. Both brilliant books, both worth getting, and both in the description below. I'll bring my guests in. So good afternoon, JoAnna. Good evening, Kate. How are you today, both of you?
Good. How are you?
Very well. So
Good, thank you.
the whole thing we're going to talk about today is we're going to go around the world with JoAnna's presentation about a whole selection of women, both from the Allied side and the Axis side, who come under this overriding category of spies, resistance, and this. And one of the things we're going to be discussing, folks, as we go along is just that terminology. You know, spies, and one immediately conjures up pictures of James Bond and trench coats with raised collars and meeting for assignations on street corners. And resistance, you get that image of people running around with machine guns and blowing things up and putting explosives on train lines and things like that. And of course, those two extremes exist, but within that and around that are all sorts of other means in which people serve their countries in a loosely kind of intelligence kind of category. Kate, before I bring you in, JoAnna, Kate, how important do you think it is that we kind of just start examining the labels that we are giving these people and reassessing sometimes what we call these people?
I think it's really important. You sort of hit the nail on the head with spies. You know, it conjures up this James Bond-esque, glamorous, romanticized kind of image, and it's not necessarily true. As you know, I write about special operations executive, and so many times it's introduced as spy history. But the majority of SOE agents weren't spies; they were secret agents. They were. Their remit was sabotage and subversion. They were using wireless sets. Very occasionally, they would send intelligence reports. So there's an aspect of spying to it. So not all secret agents are spies, but I would say all spies were secret agents.
Well, that's a nice, concise answer. And JoAnna, you know, you've done a lot of work over there with the OSS and the OSS associations. Same question to you about labeling. Is it important now in 2023 to kind of move away from some of the burdens these descriptions have and reassess what they mean?
Right. Spies or partisans are not going to be card carrying. You know, it's not like a business card. The way I think of it is that governments tended to train, have a better angle on the spy aspect, depending on the people, like the OSS, that they trained them. The partisans, less so. They weren't necessarily government sanctioned, but at the same time, the two skill sets collided quite often, and they worked together. And partisans did spy work, spies did partisan, what we would consider partisan work, which is more the combat aspect. Another thing, I mean, it's a cliche, but I always think of spies dressing better. I mean, it's silly, but you know, but again, it's all going to mesh. So, but it's not like if you meet somebody out there who was a spy, they don't say, "Hi, I am a spy." It's not like the movies in Homeland where this blonde gal's running around the Middle East with cards saying, "Hi, I'm in the CIA." No.
And I guess with conventional military units, they come with labels. You know, you are in a minesweeping flotilla, you are a commando with a directed mission to go and do something, or you're in a regiment with a shoulder title and a crest and a cap badge, and you know that there's a tradition behind that. All these things we're talking about today, they're blurring the lines. Often it's the motivation is just survival, isn't it? You know, your country has been occupied, people are around you trying to kill you, and it's not necessarily to serve, it's to just not be killed, or it's because it's fighting back in terms of just not being killed. But anyway, we're going down a rabbit hole before we even start. JoAnna has got a wonderful PowerPoint that she's going to guide me through. She's going to tell me next slide, folks. We'll kind of do questions as we go along from the viewers. I'm going to try and field the ones in the comments. Kate is going to be directing questions at JoAnna because, frankly, it's It's her subject, not mine. And I'm going to sit back and have a little bit of a more relaxed experience tonight because I'm in the capable hands of two fantastic historians. So, JoAnna, let's do our first introduction, please.
Right. So the scope, as you said earlier, it's going to be around the world. And we're going to be looking at the spies and partisans from both sides. I thought that was important. There are books about the Axis, what we in the West would call the bad guys, but not well known. So I wanted to look at some of the Axis spies and partisans, and of course the Allies. So next slide. Yep, spies. We kind of touched on this, but this isn't an exact definition. I didn't take it out of the Oxford Dictionary, but it's more of the spies or agents are generally sanctioned by a government, and they gather information and intelligence. At the same time, they're also trained in espionage, sabotage, small arms, radio, telegraph communications. So there's a combination of, it's not that spies won't get involved in the killing. They may have to. So next slide. One of the main pieces of equipment, very important, was the communications, and this is their cell phone for back then. It's their radio transmitter, and they also had a telegraph, so they needed to know Morse code. Go ahead, next slide. Your partisans, what we would know as the guerrilla or irregular troops, they don't wear the traditional uniforms. They don't have patches, and they aren't necessarily sanctioned. Most aren't, but at the same time, the governments will work with partisan groups if it serves their purposes. So next slide.
And I'm just going to just jump in there because I want Kate to expand a bit more, because Kate, with your work on the SOE, when we work backwards from 1945, the various sort of spying intelligence agencies are quite organized and set up. When you start at the beginning of the war, it's a much more complicated history, how they all came together. So maybe Kate, just run through a little bit from Britain as to just how complicated it was in that kind of 1939-40 era, when the idea of this is being established, and just kind of remind us of, just for example, using the SOE, how complicated a history it began with.
Yeah, it's incredibly complicated. They knew really as soon as war broke out that something like this was going to be needed, but to what extent and to how it was going to be furnished, so to speak, was still very much up in the air. I mean, SOE was formally sanctioned on the 22nd of July 1940, but it's not like it just dropped in by parachute. You know, the whole idea had been bandied around the War Office for quite a few months beforehand, and it was really the fall of France that sort of instigated it and made SOE, and of course the fall of Western Europe. It all happens at roughly the same time, and that's what gives them the go-ahead really to start something like Special Operations Executive. There had been forebears around beforehand. There was Section D, was propaganda units, there was Electra House. So there were units already in existence that then all came together to become Special Operations Executive. And one of the things I've been looking at quite a lot recently is a relationship between SOE and SIS, MI6. There is this sort of overarching thought that they hated one another, and to some extent they did. I mean, there's some debate and thought at the moment. There's a book come out in the last couple of years that actually accuses MI6 of causing the fall of the Prosper Network in Paris, for example. I don't know that I hold with that. I don't know that I believe that the tension between these two organizations would lead to sacrificing people, but MI6 certainly had control of SOE's wireless traffic for the first 2 years of its existence, for example, and they really didn't like one another, to the extent they'd go out on almost the same missions at the same time, and it was a matter of who got there first. And it was because MI6 already had that track record of having successful secret agents going out into the field. And to some extent they were right. SOE existed for literally the duration of Churchill's reign, for want of a better expression. And as soon as Churchill was gone, SOE went at exactly the same time. And of course, MI6 continued and does continue. So it's an incredibly fractious environment that SOE is born into.
Thank you, Kate. So back to you, JoAnna.
Can you go back one real quick? I just want you, the partisans.
Yep.
Yeah, on the right of your screen, that's Simone. We will talk about her later. She's one of the more well-known French partisan women. Actually, she was a girl at the time, but she's quite an amazing character. So,
and passed away last week, which we're going to reference later on. Yes. So, back to Belgium.
So now we're at Belgium. So Belgium's resistance, they start really early because of where they are in geographically. They're fielding hundreds of small groups comprised of former soldiers and police and civilians. And their methods of resistance range from sabotage, intelligence work, clandestine press. That was a biggie. Getting the press was very important, and support for those in hiding, and then rescuing Allied pilots. And once in a while they did go on the offensive. So they're a big part of the resistance. Next slide. One of the more famous Belgian partisans, she was a partisan. She is actually 13 when the war comes to Belgium in 1940. And Hortense Damon, Clues is her married name. And she started out as she's a courier. And then she gets into helping the Allied pilots escape back to England, and she's delivering munitions. One of the stories that is famous from her experience, she was stopped by German soldiers, and she was riding a bike, and she had a basket of eggs, and she was delivering grenades underneath the eggs. Here's this young woman who has the composure to stay calm. And she's like, the German soldier's like, what are you doing? I'm delivering eggs. Eggs were a commodity. They were rare. So she had the presence to offer the soldier an egg. And he's like, great. And then he let her go. So I can't relate, but she had incredible composure. She's is captured, and she is tortured. She survives, and in 1944 she's rescued. She's captured in 44, but she survives a year of torture, and then she's rescued by the Russians. So
was she deported?
Excuse me?
Was she deported? Was she sent to a camp?
She was sent to a camp. Yeah, it was the Ravensbrück. Yes, yeah. And she was medically tortured.
Oh,
she could never have children.
Could I just ask you a question about her age? I've read a book recently called 3 Ordinary Girls, and then I listened to a podcast on it. And one of the discussions was using such young girls. What do you think about the morals of using such young people?
They have the enthusiasm, and they're not going to be. They're not the norm. So the German soldiers aren't necessarily going to be looking out for young women to corral. I mean, they were looking for the young men. That's for sure. But the younger women, they could get around and not get caught as much, but they still got caught. It's war, and horrible decisions have to be made. And she went because her older brother was already in it.
Right.
So, and she bugged her older brother. And so finally they got her into delivering messages. So I can't relate because of, growing up in a peaceful time, fairly peaceful, but yeah, back in this environment, I could see young women going ahead and doing it if they can physically. So next slide. Freddie, she's a character. For those in the States, to understand her story, you have to look at where she grew up, and that her town is right on the border of Germany. And they had gotten smacked in World War I. Her family had gotten brutalized by the German army then, and she was not going to have it. Her daddy had been harassed by the Germans in World War I, and she was drafted to go work in the German munitions factories. So it's right, which makes sense because it's right across the border. But she escaped from the train. She actually jumped from the train and then joined the French resistance, and she never looked back. And she's like, I wasn't going to have it. So I think she saw her dad maybe felt guilty that he hadn't fought back, but I mean, what are you going to do? So she's got a book that your audience might be interested in, Girl in Belgium Resistance. So, and she was only 16.
Well, and I think one of the questions that's going to come up is the incredible variety of motivations for these young women, and not sometimes young women, to get involved in this, because it sort of stands to reason if you're male of conscription age in whatever country, you're kind of forced into kind of being motivated because you're called up. And of course, that's the situation. But for these women, I fear we're not going to get any single dominating motivation. It's going to be a whole variety of reasons: frustration, guilt out of not being able to be involved, just desperation, elder brother being involved in it, seeing someone being arrested. There's going to be a million reasons why people get involved, but in dissecting why they get involved will be fascinating. But we'll move on slides, and we've kind of covered this bit already with Kate a bit, but if you want to add anything, JoAnna, you're welcome to.
I just wanted to put this in so your British audience didn't think that I was leaving them out, but you guys are going to talk about them next week.
Yeah, Kate's kind of got SOE covered, so we're going to do that in a separate show with Kate next week. And we've done it in the past, so yeah, we are. Kate's got that well. So moving on to Burma.
Burma. Yeah, all the way back, all the way over the other side of the globe. Maya Yi. Again, our history in America is taught out of context. It's like Pearl Harbor. It's like World War II was so much bigger than just certain little events that we know about. In Burma, the British had been there for decades, I guess. And she had gotten her start at fighting insurgencies against the British colonialists. World War II comes up, the Japanese push the British out, and Maya's like, no. Yeah, so she joined up with, she was one of the leaders in Burma. They have to she carried a sword and poison bottle. Now, I didn't do a lot of research on her, but my best guess is that the sword was for the enemy and the poison was for herself. She wasn't going to get captured, which makes sense. Now, her group in Burma had to escape over the mountains into India. She hurt her foot along the way, and some of the men wanted to carry her, and she's like, nope. So she got over the mountains, and her job in India is just as important as all the others who are doing actual fighting, but she's contributing to the pamphlets that are dropped into Burma. Information is just as important in wartime as the bullets. And she helps with these pamphlets that are detailing the Japanese atrocities so the people know what's going on.
Incredible stuff. Moving on, China.
Yep. China. Here's another piece of history that, Japan and China had been fighting a long time before World War II. In fact, 31, Japan invades Manchuria. 33, they invade again, but then it's on a grander scale. And Chiang Kai-shek,
Yep.
He has a non-resistance policy. Now, he's the nationalist. And the volunteers, they form 9 armies, and the volunteers are all like, we're going to wage war against Japan. So then in 37, World War II officially on the history books starts. And that's when the Central Chinese government finally resists Japanese. And then you get the Chinese communists coming in, and then the Nationalist Party. They're both waging war against guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. So that's China's World War II in a nutshell. I'm going to put my one phone out.
and Kate, this is where this whole idea that JoAnna and you mentioned about whether it's not government sanctioned, because the Western world is looking at China, and unlike the situation in Yugoslavia, they're not quite sure which horse to back. It's a very simplistic way of putting it, but it's not quite clear from the outside exactly what's going on within China. I mean, we've done a whole week of shows about the Sino-Japanese War, but it's that whole, the SOE is somewhat easier to classify in that section. It does have this setting up by the British government. But when you get to the Allies being involved in events in China or Yugoslavia, it becomes a lot more complicated as to exactly what the motivations are of these organizations and armies, and who their exact enemies are. It's a very complicated subject.
It certainly seems it. I got to admit, I know nothing about China. I'm afraid I missed your shows. I will put my hand up and say that. But yeah, certainly in terms of Yugoslavia, it's knowing which horse to back, and also working out who you're going to support in the long term. Because when the war ends, whoever you've supported with arms and intelligence and equipment and agents, is probably going to go on and prosper. And you want to make sure, really, that you've backed the right person. So one of the main missions in Greece, the destruction of the Gorgo-Patamas viaduct, their main success not only was getting the viaduct down, but actually managing to get all these opposing factions just for one day to actually work together towards a common goal. So yeah, it sounds incredibly complex.
And we could do a whole show about the politics of France and Jean Moulin and all those various people that had different aspirations. In fact, that can come up next week. But let's move on to our example from China. So back to you, JoAnna.
The first woman from China is Zhang. She spoke fluent Japanese, and she's an actress and musician. Now, she's a Chinese spy. She's half Japanese. Her mother was Japanese. And even though her family's half Japanese, the entire family opposed the Japanese invasion. And so she joins an underground guerrilla unit that's considered with the Nationalist Party. And then she's involved in a failed attempt to assassinate one of Japan's governors. So this Ding Ma-kun, he was installed by the Japanese. That fails, and she is executed in Western Shanghai along the side of the road at age 22. Oh. So next slide. Chang was a guerrilla fighter who actively took part in the fight. She's actually in the combat. And in 38, she's captured in combat, tortured, raped in prison. And this photo here is probably one of the more it is it really hit me because it's her execution photo. And the guys behind her are going to execute her within minutes, and they bayoneted her to death. And that, I mean, in Western society, you don't expect to hear that. But I called my friend who was a China Marine. He went to China after World War II, and kind of talked to him about it. He said, he gave me a better context. He said that the Chinese used the bayonet as well. So it was a torturous death, but at the same time, in that context, both sides were, it wasn't uncommon to use the bayonet.
Wow.
It's just uncommon to hear about it. But
and that photo should be in dictionaries under the word defiance, shouldn't it?
Oh, yeah.
If that doesn't absolutely symbolize someone who is going to her death, but like, fuck you, that's
yeah. Oh yeah, and she knows that there's millions of Chinese behind her who are going to take these guys out.
Wow, what a photo.
Yeah.
Moving along.
Yep. I can't pronounce her name, but
Zoe possibly, yeah.
So she's with the Communist Party. She joins in 1926. 1935, she is a political commissar with a guerrilla unit, 2nd Regiment of the 3rd Army of the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army. Very long title, but they are fighting against the Japanese in the Northeast. She's seriously wounded and captured in 35. 36, she's executed, and she's just as defiant as Cheng. She's singing loudly an ode to the flag, red flag, and shouting anti-Japanese slogans. So in 1956, they made a poster, and that's what you see on the right, commemorating her fight.
And that poster there, it brings up that whole subject we're talking about the way spies, agents, resistance have been portrayed in media, because that poster is sending a real message, isn't it? And how these stories are maybe used decades later to tell a story that perhaps they weren't telling at the time, but they're being used. The hammer and sickle in the background there, and all the imagery that goes with that poster that may or may not be quite what the motivation was back in the 1930s. But anyway, it's an interesting poster. But we're going down a rabbit hole, but which I don't want to. But we're off to Denmark.
Another question before we go to Denmark,
please,
because this is such a new area to me. There's a bit of a theme of capture, torture. What are they trying to get? Do you know what they're trying to get out of the torture? Because the women I've written about, they seem to be trying to get more information, names of other agents, other missions. I'm knees deep in studying SOE in Holland at the moment, and they're trying to basically they're trying to send out more agents so they can be captured and tortured. But do we know what the aim of it all was, or was it simply punishment, prolonging the agony before execution?
This is an educated guess on what the Japanese did in Nanking. I think it was just sadistic. Yeah. Just what some of the Japanese thought was fun. Yeah. Because they're going to kill them anyways. Yeah. So
that would be my opinion as well. That it's the Sino-Japanese week. That it's just part of the course there. It's part of the whole process. That the barbary is just, it's accepted. That's a weird way to say, but it's not commonplace on both sides in some ways.
Right. And from the research I've done and the Marines I did talk to who fought in the Pacific, back then, the Japanese Army, it wasn't looked upon as respected. They respected the dead more than the living. And the Marines I all talked to were like, we knew that game. And they didn't take prisoners at all. So it was par for the course.
Okay, let's move to Denmark.
Yes, going back to the other side of the world, Denmark, for all those, I had to double check where Denmark is. It's that tiny little country right above Germany. They get involved early in the war as well, 1940 to 45, Danish resistance. Germany takes over, and they're sharing intelligence with Britain, conducting sabotage, assassinating collaborators. That was also part of it. Next slide. Monica, she's interesting. Prior to the war, she helped, I believe, create Coco Chanel line, and then she complete reverse. She's getting involved in the Danish underground, and she starts out with helping out with underground papers, and then in 42. She gets involved with Jacob Jensen with the SOE, which Kate may be discussing Monica next week. Their group starts getting involved in, I took notes here. They start blowing up docks. They're distributing weapons, hiding explosives. So they're doing some heavy duty missions. Jacob gets captured and he gets tortured. And it is interesting to look at the contrast between what the Germans were doing. The Germans tortured Jacob to get information, and Jacob does crack, gives up a whole lot of agents in the Denmark area. She's captured. She is initially going to be executed, but it's commuted, and she dies in prison of pneumonia. So one of the other things about Monica I found interesting, she's British, but her mom's Irish. So the Irish have some claim to her and may come up with her name in Ireland and places.
Wow. Brilliant.
So, Ebba, she's another well-known Danish partisan. She helps ferry Jews escaping Europe to safety. So she joins the Holgen Dansk resistance groups. She was known as the girl with the red cap because she wore a red hat. And she, good, I did include the link. That's her interview. That link will take you to her interview, and it's very interesting. So a lot of these women are well documented. It's just you have to keep looking on the internet. So she participated in 500 missions, and then in 44 she became pregnant and she resigned. Then after the war, she continues to be a pioneer. She studied chemical engineering and immunology, and she earned a Ph.D. in and then was a dean at a veterinarian school, I believe. So
that also brings up the question as well of some of these people getting involved who do not want to be involved at combat, but are working on a more humanitarian aspect. That came up in the show we did about the escape line from the Netherlands through to Paris, is that some of these people they weren't necessarily wanting to pick up a weapon, but they were just trying to help people who were being persecuted. And that, I guess, brings up another category, because that's neither a spy or resistant. That's a lifesaver, a Samaritan, I suppose, in some ways. Is that another aspect that you've investigated, Kate, where these people whose motivation is simply about saving life without necessarily having any kind of political opinion at all?
Yes, I'm uncovering some at the moment who are, certainly involved in this kind of work, and Denmark's probably the most obvious place, or Scandinavia really is a very clear place for this. But also, I don't want to give too much away, but I am finding some women who went into Eastern Europe, for example, to try and work against the deportation of the Jews.
Wow, brilliant stuff. Well, we're off to France now, which you can both you've got this covered, you two of you. So, JoAnna, I'll let you go through it first, and Kate, jump in with your comments.
This is probably the best known country when it comes to resistance, the French underground. They were involved in, publishing newspapers, providing firsthand intelligence, helping escaped pilots. So, and in American history, we do learn about them briefly. So, next slide. Andre, her code name was Denise. Now, she was recruited by the SOE, and she's one of the first women to parachute into France. So I thought that was interesting. She's working alongside she joins up with a French resistance group, and she's working with them, and she's captured in 1944, and she's executed at age 25. But what I thought of, it was interesting, weird about her execution. She was sent to a camp. It was a concentration camp, but the male officers seemed to feel uncomfortable executing her. So they gave her a shot of like propofol and then threw her in the ovens, which I'm not a psychologist, but why not just shoot her? I
go into a lot of detail on this in my book Mission France about the execution, about why the injections. The injections were supposed to be lethal, but they weren't. There wasn't enough. Phenol to kill them outright. So we do know that at least one of them came to, and it's probably her. That she came to when she was put into the crematoria and scratched the face of the man. I seem to be coming up with all the grim things. Why me? Scratched the face of the guy putting her into the oven, and he then went to a party. One of the reasons the execution was that night was the doctor was leaving that night to go on to Auschwitz. And this guy, Peter Strauss, said, "I've done some dreadful things in my time, but I'm going to hell for this."
Wow.
Why didn't they just shoot her? Because she's an enemy combatant. So
because they were supposed to be kept in the prison at Karlsruhe for the duration of the war, and it was only because the Karlsruhe warders were saying they didn't have time to look after people with special conditions, so to speak. So they contacted the RSHA, who said just take them to the nearest camp and let them deal with them. So not all of them were shot, and these four are the ones who were killed by lethal injection.
Well, fun. A better story is Marie's story. Her code name was Hedgehog, which I like hedgehogs. So she was involved with the espionage in France from 1941 to 1945, and one of the men that worked under her got information about the V2 program. So they didn't actually go and see the rockets. They got the information from a German officer who was yakking, which was a lot of times how they got their information. Just getting these German officers to start talking. So then she survived the war. Next slide. Martha Huffnug, she's age 24. Her code name was Martha Ulrich. She came from a Orthodox Jewish family. In 1944, she officially enlists in the intelligence service of the French First Army. And they have her going into Germany, sneaking into Germany, and pretending to be a nurse. And she looks at the German defenses, reports back. She looks at the number of Germans that are still deployed, and she's reporting back on that. So she's working by herself to do this, and which is amazing. And she survived. So
Wow.
I thought that was a really interesting story. Marie, she is part of a communication system that helps relay information to families of prisoners. They couldn't always get information to these prisoners, so they would sneak information to the family members and back and forth, which helped out with morale. So, and her network, she survived. Next slide. And Simone, she was only age 18. She killed at least 2 Germans in the August 44 when they're pushing the Germans out of Paris. And she helped capture 25 Germans. And she's holding there one of the MP, I don't know if it's the MP38, MP40, which model. But have either of you held one of those?
Yeah, I've shot one.
Oh, really? They're awkward. They are awkward.
They are. Not that the stun gun's much better, but for me, I preferred shooting that with the magazine out to the side. But yeah, that was, and you can see actually, she doesn't look particularly comfortable with it, does she? Certainly on the picture on the left. So yeah.
Yeah, the rate of fire of those. I mean, the rate of fire, but she must have used it quite a bit to get used to the quirks of the machine gun. So she, as we said earlier, she just passed away last week at 97. Oh wow!
And become something of a poster girl for the whole resistance movement, and we could go down that whole rabbit hole of which resistance movements were remembered by France sooner than others. And basically, folks, no surprises, it was the ones who weren't the communists who tended to be remembered post-war with more affection, more movies, more memorials, more everything. And the communists basically got sort of sideways shunted for various reasons that are still evolving in France, with France acceptance of its past and acceptance of its roles, things like that. But that it brings us that subject of how France or how the world has remembered these stories, and certain people have become poster figures for it, and other people weren't, because of the various motivations or politics of the groups they were part of. But that's another subject.
But didn't de Gaulle say that everybody was resistance and all the collaborators just got to disappear into the background?
Yeah, yes, de Gaulle said a few things, didn't he? But, yeah, it's a massive, great rabbit hole. But another couple of amazing figures, and so I'll hand it back to JoAnna and Kate. So here we go.
Lucy, she's age 28. She was a history teacher. And in 1940, she helped organize a resistance group that carried out sabotage missions and distributed flyers, helped publish one of the more famous Liberty papers, and she helped rescue downed Allied pilots and other resistance fighters who got captured, and she survives. And Rose, she's age 42. She's an art historian, and the Germans had her in charge of one of the big museums there in France. And as the Germans were stealing the art pieces, she kept detailed records of all the looting. And she helps the monuments men after the war.
Kate Blanchett character in the film.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Fantastic.
Yes. Yep. So again, the way to resist is very different, but you find your skill set and you use your skill sets to resist. And definitely. So that's the neat part.
That's a really good point to jump in and have Kate and you just discuss this whole idea of what is resistance. Because when I did the show with Dr. Chris Millington about a year and a half ago, he said, and I've said this repeatedly on World War II TV, that he finds the words resistance and collaboration too burdened with expectations, and he prefers the word defiance and accommodation. So if the Germans come to you, knock on your door and say, you must provide straw for our hay for our horses, and you say yes, because if you don't say yes, you might get shot, that is accommodation, not necessarily collaboration. Although there is, at the other extreme of it, there is the people in occupied Europe who would sell Allied pilots for gold. Those kind of horrible people existed as well. And resistance, again, I'm going back to my blowing up trains with explosives thing. That is definitely an aspect of resistance that did happen. And Kate, by the way, folks, if ever you get a chance to catch one of Kate's live presentations at somewhere like we have, where she goes through the whole, bombs hidden in rat poo and things and detonators and all that kind of stuff, all that brilliant stuff. She goes all through that, and no one carries a Sten gun in 2023 like Dr. Vigers does. But anyway, resistance can also be trying to preserve a nation's history. That is also resistance. It's not allowing the occupier to remove or steal your country's traditions, your country's culture. So Kate, when you're in your work you're doing now, do you have a kind of definition for what resistance is, or is it evolving and changing all the time?
I think for me it evolves quite a lot, because resistance can be from such a minuscule thing. I don't know if anyone's read or seen The Book Thief, for example, but I always think, she sits by the river and shouts, "I hate Hitler." That's an act of resistance. And then, it's right the way through to harboring the Jews, blowing up factories, cutting telecommunications lines, harboring Allied airmen. It's vast and it's huge. And can you be called a resistor because you said "I hate Hitler"? Probably not, but you're doing something, I guess, against the regime. I've got a little bit lost in that, but I think resistance is vast. Saying that you resist to play to your strengths is a really interesting one. I've just read the personnel file of a woman who was brought into SOE because she made homemade explosives as a hobby, and they thought she might be the right kind of person. But then again, you look at some of the reports that I talk about ad infinitum. I see a lot of familiar names in the chat here, and the reports are dreadful. She's a terrible wireless operator, but we're going to send her anyway because we need one. So there's a case of, certainly within SOE, there's a case of human supply and demand going on, as well as playing to strengths. Resistance itself, like this, I mean, they're already there, they're already in France or wherever, and they have to choose, I guess, what it is that they're going to do. And in that respect, then yes, they'll play to their strengths, like the girl.
And it can just be a state of mind, can't it?
It's just her innocence, isn't it?
And it can just be a state of mind. It can be a I'm going to resist what's happening in my country, even just by being defiant, just walking around with your head held high. Okay, that's not going to get rid of the Nazis or the occupiers, but it's going to send a message. If everybody is haughty and makes it life difficult for the occupiers and grumbles when you're asked for a pass and tries to just slow down the German mechanism, that is resistance in its own way. And yet at the other end, you have keep going back to the people blowing up trains. But we're going to bring to Josephine Baker, because she's a really good example of someone who isn't necessarily going out blowing up trains, but is absolutely resisting everything that is happening.
Can you go back to Rose real quick, Paul?
Yeah, we can.
I wanted to dovetail what you were saying. Rose had the long game. She's resisting strategically. Yeah. She's got all these Germans occupying her country, but she knows in her heart that they're not going to stay. And so by documenting where these pieces are going, she helps find them later. So she never gives up in her heart or head either. So that's, resistance it's hard to describe.
And we could go down that I'm saying rabbit hole so many times my viewers are going to get drunk today, but we could go down that whole thing, because Kate mentioned it played by Cate Blanchett in the Monuments Men movie. But from everything I read about Rose is that she was able to do what she did because she did kind of blend into the background of it. I'm not saying she was mousy, but she wasn't kind of a dominating for Cate Blanchett. If she's the kind of person, if she walks into a room, all eyes are on Cate Blanchett because of the cheekbones and the eyes and stuff. So movies in some ways can do a disservice to these people because they're making it all about to be an attractive woman as opposed to being what she was, which was a methodical collator of artifacts that did that incredible office work, really, but wasn't necessarily anything like Cate Blanchett. Not that I have any problem with Cate Blanchett being in a movie. I think she's a great actress, but maybe it's that whole way that they're portrayed. Kate, I'm sure you can go on a whole massive great slant about how women are portrayed as agents in movies.
Charlotte Gray.
Charlotte Gray, yeah, there we go, yeah. But anyway,
so and Josephine's like that. She could blend in, but going with her backstory, I did a little more research on her. She was born Frida Josephine McDonald in St. Louis, Missouri. She experienced the East St. Louis riots in 1917. I had to look that up. And at least 200 African Americans were murdered in that riot.
Wow.
And now, how did she get involved with the entertainment business? Her parents, she came from a family that her parents were entertainers. She goes into the business. She moves to New York City. She's part of the Harlem Renaissance. And then she's offered a chance to go to Paris, and she grabs it. And in Paris, she becomes a famous performer. In 1939, she's able to naturally socialize with the Germans and Italians at the embassies and nightclubs, which, again, taking a step back, it's weird because the Germans and Italians are such, they're racist, but they like her, and she's very charming. And so, and also she was able, when her travels took her naturally to places so she could report back, okay, the Germans have this amount of men here, their airfields are here, the harbors are, they have good defenses. So she's naturally put into places. And that's what you find nowadays. Your intelligence groups are going to find people who aren't the card carrying members, but they still work for them. So she had an important role, and she does survive, and she passed away in 1975.
And memorialized in France with a position in the Pantheon a couple of years ago, which is an amazing honor in France. And she's going back to this idea about agents and with spies and what we think of it, because Josephine was hiding in plain sight. She transcended class. She translated nationalities. She could speak multiple languages. She would move in all kind of stratas of society. And the fact she was doing this underground work was hidden in plain view. I mean, she would have railway porters put her luggage onto trains. Inside it was stuff she was carrying surreptitiously. Then the other side of it, you have these agents who are kind of living in barns and terrified and moving, who are concealed. And Josephine's the other end of that. It's fascinating. Again, it reminds us that there are different types of way you can be an agent, are many and varied.
Right. And it floors me that the Germans and Italians never got that. I mean, they should have been training their officers and their personnel a lot better, but they didn't.
They're men. They're distracted by a pretty face. It's all very, very, very easy. We just get.
So why aren't women in charge of the world, Paul?
An inch of cleavage, and we lose all our ability to function. That's speaking for myself, there, folks. But let's move to Germany, and we're going to look at the Axis side of things.
I didn't realize, but I thought there might be. We always learn about the SS, but the Germans did have a military intelligence service. Yeah. And this group here, they were there from 1920 to 1944. They focused on espionage, sabotage, and then counterintelligence. So they're trying to find who are the spies. So next slide. Matilda, she was kind of a double agent. She started out with the French resistance. She's captured by the Gestapo. She is tortured, and they turn her. And she's sent to London, but then she's captured by the MI5, and they figured out that she was spying for the Germans, and she's imprisoned. She is sent back in 1949. She's put on trial in France. She gave a lot of names to the Germans. And so France did sentence her to death, but then it's commuted to 20 years. So,
and wasn't she said to be having an affair with Hugo Bleicher, who's the one who infiltrated a lot of F section, for example, the arrest of Odette and Peter Churchill.
Yeah.
So she was said to be in a relationship with him, so feeding him a lot of information and vice versa, I believe.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Well,
I don't know.
Vera Erickson, she was an interesting story. She's 28, and she was born in Serbia. She's adopted by the Schlossberg family, who flee Russia during the revolution. They initially go to Denmark, and then they wind up, though, they go to Paris. And she becomes a ballet dancer there. And she is approached by the British Secret Intelligence Service, a different group than the SOE at the time. She's spying on the Russians for the British. It gets really convoluted. Then in 37, the Germans ask her to spy on the Russians, and everybody's spying on the Russians. And then in 40, she's recruited officially by the German military intelligence group, and she is trained to help pave the way for the German invasion, which is interesting because I've always heard that there wasn't an invasion, or there's always that debate. Was there going to be an invasion?
How serious was the planning?
Yes, yeah. Exactly. So this seems to give credence to there was definitely firm discussion on a German invasion. She lands in Scotland with 2 other German spies. They're captured. 2 of them are captured. She and one of the male spies. They're captured immediately at Port Gordon. Then the other male spy is captured in Waverley Station. Pretty sure that she was always a double agent. She was always a British agent. So she gave the information to the British because they were captured really fast. The 2 males are shot, and she disappeared into history. So, and the German invasion never happened.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's at first I was thinking, well, she didn't really do much, and I'm like, well, that's silly. She did. She took away a lot of resources, and the German intelligence actually gave all their information to the British. So she did a lot. And it's interesting that she disappears.
Do we know which? So was it the SIS that she was part of?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, and I guess the 2 don't share their information, or I don't know how it worked. I doubt it. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
feels like there's more work to be done on this particular woman.
Yes,
definitely.
Mm-hmm.
But someone who has been written about a lot, Melita von Stauffenberg. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So the Germans needed test pilots, and she was a test pilot 37 to 43 initially for the Luftwaffe. And in 44, she's one of the co-conspirators that tried to assassinate Hitler. That fails. She goes to prison, but they need test pilots, so they get her back out there. And in 45, she's involved in a plane crash. She died at the hospital, and just a little research I did, it kind of was implied that her injuries weren't life-threatening, but then she died at the hospital. So I don't know if there's some debate if the assassination attempt caught up with her, but she died just 1 month before the war ended. So
intriguing.
Being a test pilot was quite dangerous.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh God, yeah, definitely. Is she in Claire Molly's book?
Yeah, she's one of the 2 Claire writes about. Yeah, her and Hannah Reich. Yeah,
I haven't read that one yet. But...
Yeah, no, it's a great book, and it's interesting their careers, huge parallels and huge differences, because where one was a fervent Nazi, Melita wasn't, and yet they had these kind of similar careers. But we're going down another rabbit hole. God, people are going to be drunk. We're off to Indonesia now. So
yes,
back to you, JoAnna.
Rasuna Said, she was known as the Lioness. She came from a devout Muslim family. She's an activist initially against the Dutch imperialists, and she campaigned for women's rights, particularly for their education and politics, which, going down the rabbit hole of obviously Muslims in Indonesia are very different from what we would consider traditional in Saudi Arabia, say. They were very much open to trying to get women their education and being more involved in politics. And so much so that she is arrested by the Dutch in 32. And then in 34, she's released. 38, she's briefly arrested by the Japanese, but the Japanese realized that Said was a significant leader in the community and let her go. She works with a group that is pro-Japanese, which I thought was interesting, but she was just using the Japanese for their ends of getting equality and freedom. So she does survive, and she continued her work after the war. So more information needs to be learned about her for sure.
Yeah, definitely. But the variety of backgrounds these women come from and ended up in is as we said earlier, is extraordinary. So Japan now, moving around the globe.
Right. Japan, they had this group. Yeah, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but they were like the German SS, the US CIA, the FBI, the British MI5, MI6. Their role, the contempt. Anyways, they conducted internal and external surveillance information. They gathered information, Signet. That's just taking radio. That sort. They had spies. They had the Army, Navy intelligence, diplomats. Diplomats a lot of times are used as spies. That's not a secret. That's just what they do. Yep. Then you have open source intelligence, newspapers, and then you have brutal interrogation. So, which does work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they worked with the Germans and the Italians. So when I looked for a Japanese spy, I thought it was going to be a Japanese woman, but next slide.
It turned out not to be. Yes.
It's Miss Dickinson. Yes, she was a spy for the Japanese. She becomes friends with the Japanese consul general, and she ran a rare doll shop in New York. And I think that's how she became friends with some of these Japanese higher ups. And in 42, the FBI began intercepting letters that were suspicious. And the first letter from her that they didn't know at the time was from her, but it discussed wonderful doll hospital and noted that there was 3 old English dolls, and the letter also mentioned fishnets and balloons. So another woman who worked for the U.S. Coast Guard, Elizabeth Friedman, she's a cryptanalyst. She helped break the code, and dolls were 3 warships. The doll hospital was a West Coast-based shipyard, and fishnets and balloons were the coastal defenses. So they eventually traced it back to Miss Dickinson, and she's arrested. She blamed her dead husband. They didn't believe her, and she did it. I think she did it for power. $13,000 isn't really that much. And that smug look, she just, I don't know, she definitely did it. So, and that's sometimes motivation too with spies. It's just the power.
Power and cash. Yeah. Money talks. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on.
Italy. She's a sad story in that she got involved because she wanted the adventure, and she was not well trained. But the British needed bodies, and they recruited her. And in 41, she goes out on her first mission. She's immediately tailed. She forgot cash. So where does she go? She needed cash to go to get on the train. and she goes back to her parents' house, her mom's house. And she was easily, the police who were tailing her were easily traced who she was and what she was doing. And she's arrested, put on trial in 43, and then executed by firing squad. So, her adventure turned sour real quick. So it's a tough business, and just it sounds like it's easy gathering information, and it's not. So
no, definitely, and we had this idea from Kate and the France story, that France, there seems to be a lot of training, a lot of preparation. Yet other times, Asians are sent in, as you say, there with little to no experience, little to no training, no methodology, and the wide ranging experiences are, I guess, predictable. But yeah, it is sad, but not unsurprising how many of these stories end in a sad way, though. That for every one that survives, there's another one who dies in terrible conditions. But to be expected.
I don't think there's any rhyme or reason to it either. You don't necessarily get that the agents who shone through in training are necessarily the ones who survive. It all does seem to be down to sometimes in the wrong place at the wrong time, or you've been trailed and you didn't notice, or you've just spoken to the wrong person who will then hand you over for big tracts of cash. I've never found any parity between how good they were at home or their experiences versus how effective they were in the field. You mentioned Andre Burrell earlier. She worked on the Pat escape line before she became SOE. She was highly experienced, and yet she just gets caught up in the downfall of the Prosper network and just ends up having that absolutely awful fate.
And it just come up in a sidebar, just luck, just bad luck or good luck. Some people survive their first mission perfectly, go back on a second one and get captured the first day, or whatever it would be. It's that those variables that are so intriguing. But we're off to the Netherlands now. So back into a more familiar territory, in that most people watching, I think, are more familiar with France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But back to you, JoAnna.
Right. So the Dutch resistance, they start out in 1940, more nonviolent hiding Jews. Most famous is Corrie ten Boom. She's from the Netherlands. Her family was hiding the Jews, some Jewish families. And then more so in 41 to 44, they start, the resistance starts getting more kinetic, more involved in the counterintelligence, domestic sabotage, communications network, and providing support for the Allied forces. So your show discussed these sisters. When was that?
Oh, about a year ago. Yeah,
Okay.
something like that. Yeah, but we can worth hearing the story again, because it's simply amazing.
Right. They start out. So their family did start out hiding Jews, and Truus and Freddie Oversteger, ages 16 and 14. They get involved, and they start out doing the communications, helping out with the leaflets, and then, like I said, the family was helping to hide some Jewish families. Then they get more heavily involved, and they start with sabotaging military installations. They helped ambush and kill German officers, and both survived.
Yeah.
So
we'll let you viewers go and look into how and particularly how these women used to kill German officers. But it's straight out of the movies, and involves charming and taking them off and letting them drop their guard, and then killing them in some cases. And Sophie Polderman's book is extraordinary and worth reading, in my opinion. We'll keep going. We're off to the Philippines now.
Yep. Over to the Philippines. They had at least 1,000 guerrilla units and 260,715 guerrillas. 33,000, at least 33,000 fighters were lost in the war. Next slide. Maggie, she was 22 years old, and she's recruited by the and she's a special agent. with gathering intel and getting medical supplies for the people and radio parts. She's arrested 3 times by the Japanese, and she escapes. And she's finally, at one point, she did bribe a guard to escape. And she joins the Philippine Army as a corporal, and she goes with the Signal Corps, and she earned the Silver Star. And I included a link that shows her citation and why she earned the Silver Star. And she did amazing things to help out with the war effort. So
and raises that interesting point about the more active a country is with resistance, the more retaliations can come down from the occupiers, because you've only got to read James Scott's fantastic but harrowing book Rampage about what happened in Manila in 1945, and you have to kind of connect the dots and realize that although we're never going to excuse the Japanese barbarity at all, they are particularly aggressive in the Philippines, probably because of a direct result of these tens of thousands of resistance fighters that have been trying to kill them and trying to get rid of them for years. So, Kate, is that something that you've come up in your research, this idea about at what point does setting up resistance networks, SOE networks, just in fact endanger the population because of the reprisal aspect?
Oh, hugely. Yeah, absolutely hugely. The act of sabotage that was discovered, people would be rounded up, from the prisons. They'd pick a random 50, or they just round up 50 people in the streets or whatever it was. But retaliation, when people ask me about the success of SOE, I will always counteract it with these dreadful reprisals of people just being swept along in it. If I can just look in the chat as well, someone's just mentioned Joska Mecca. Wait a couple of years and you'll find out more about her as well. She was Dutch resistance too.
Cool. That's fine. And that whole aspect, we talked about the movies and the imagery, is that I don't think enough of the movies and things talk about that the impact you just mentioned there, Kate, the reprisal aspect, the knock-on effect of this. It's all very good to write these daring do books about what the agents did, what the resistance people did, but you've got to follow it up with the aftermath. I mean, we still don't know exactly the cause of Oradour-sur-Glane, the horrible massacre near Limoges in 1940, just after D-Day. But there's an element of suggestion that it was because of resistance activity elsewhere and a mistaken name, and 800 plus French civilians murdered by the Das Reich division. So you've got to tell both sides that the intelligence assets that were gathered by the Allies has to be offset by the danger that the countries are being put in by these acts of sabotage. And it's all about studying the whole aspect of it, because it is the whole picture, I think.
Yeah, you have to look at the whole picture, and it's very easy to sort of romanticize or glamorize all of this and say, what they're all wonderful and daring do, and the black and white movies. But no, it's not, and it has huge repercussions. Oradour's a really interesting case in point, isn't it? Because it's a bit like Lidica in the fall of Operation Anthropoid. That really was a case of mistaken identity. With Oradour, I think that some leader had been arrested. It was everything happened on the 10th of June around that area. A leader was kidnapped by the Maquis, and this was the reprisal.
Yeah, and it was another town on the Glane, not Oradour, that was a similar name, and the German commander's name. But but there's still examinations of why it was. But that aspect about it's what we often talk about it on this channel, is that measuring the achievements of special forces, and we're going to include spying and agents under special forces, an umbrella term. Sometimes it's about morale back home. Sometimes it's about sending a message back to the public. The Dambusters raid, the Doolittle raid. Some of the other commandos. Sometimes it's about sending a message to the enemy of no matter where you are, we can get to you, weakening their resolve, making them fearful. But it's always the civilians. It's the innocent who end up being the victims, isn't it? That's the tragic thing, is that these resistance activities, even if they aid the Allied cause, it's often and usually innocent bystanders, villagers in the nearby location, who end up falling victim to any reprisals carried out by the enemy who's been affected, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. A comment's just come up that they were for sabotage and not for spying, which I guess is true because it's a lot more obvious, isn't it? That you know, you've blown a factory up, or you've cut a line, or you know, a train's been blown up. So it's a lot more apparent, I guess. But that's not to say that when people did carry intelligence and were caught, that things wouldn't be done as a result of that. You know, agents carrying the plans to the port of Marseille, for example, you know, if they were caught, there would be repercussions because of what had been going on in the area. There had to have been
the Germans the Germans just need that reason. They need that little smoking gun, literally and figuratively, to kind of go in there. We're doing this because of this, even if the link is tenuous, even if it's, you know, just someone. All they need is that excuse to go in there and clamp down on things, and it's a fantastic thing. But we're going back to the Philippines, back to JoAnna. So we've talked about this lady before, but I'm interested in your viewpoint, please, JoAnna.
She became a colonel. She rose to the rank of colonel in the Markings guerrillas. So she is one of the guerrilla fighters, and she's right in there with the combat. She helped plan their missions, and one of the section groups was even named after her, and they participated in the battle Yipo Dam on March 19th, 1945. So she's quite heavily involved in all the fighting, and she became known as one of her nicknames was Brains. So yeah.
When we did the show with Teresa about this a few weeks ago, and how one of the few examples of a woman actually leading huge numbers of men in combat. I mean, she wasn't just she was absolutely a commander of fighters. There was no little pretty young thing just in the background carrying messages. She was, you know, absolutely leading from the front, which is a role we don't necessarily associate that much with World War II because of the whole reasons and baggage of that. But she was absolutely doing it in the front there. But we're off another country. We're off to Poland, and if we're talking about repercussions and generally terrible experiences of a whole country because of the war, Poland is the top of most people's lists as a country that everything that happened bad happened on an extraordinary, horrible scale in Poland. So back to you, JoAnna.
Right. So I kind of, since Poland was hit from both sides, I kind of focused just on the Warsaw Uprising, which happened from August to October of 44. That sees several thousand women and children, and I mean children, they're in the front lines with weapons, taking on the Nazis, and Polish casualties were 150,000 civilians / partisans. I mean, once you're picking up a weapon, you're a partisan, but at any rate, they knew going in that the casualties would be high. And
absolutely. And it's this is the absolute motivation out of desperation. We talked about that earlier. There's some places where it's more about power, or in Poland, in Warsaw, it was survival in many ways. But you're going to give us a couple of examples here. So Jadwiga and Helena.
Yeah, the first one on the left, Jadwiga, she's a member of the Polish resistance. She's murdered, and I use the word murder here, by the Rona. The Rona, you might know more about them, Paul. They're Polish working with the Nazis, and she's captured and then murdered by them. And she's murdered in August of 44. She's one of the older ones that I found. She's 54 when she's in the Warsaw Uprising. And then we have Helena. She's 40, and she was a lieutenant in the underground women's section. And she fought she helped lead the group, and she's one of the few that survived, and she's highly decorated for her actions during the Warsaw Uprising. So again, so much information needs to be researched and put out there about all these deeds, which is great. So
it's not getting too much. I mean, Poland is doing a fantastic job, and Alina, our friend, has come on a few times and talked about Poland, and Alexandra Ritchie out there. But the recent color film with interviews with survivors and resistors kind of didn't necessarily get a very good English language release. So you kind of have to go to Poland to find this. It's not necessarily being spread around the world like the French resistance story, as we talked about earlier, is definitely world known. A lot of the world doesn't know about Poland.
I think it's getting better known.
Yeah.
And further back in the comments, there was a question about SOE in Poland and the Home Army. And there was a woman, Elżbieta Zawaka. Both myself and another well-known author discovered her at exactly the same time. So she will be coming to the fore very shortly, and the stories of the Home Army. And I think that's the aim of a lot of this stuff, is to try and get it into the mainstream. You know, some of these stories are really well known in their own countries, but they're not well known outside of them. And it's really, I guess, our job to try and push that. And that's why this presentation is so fantastic. I hardly heard of any of these women, but to hear these stories pushed to the front, how absolutely brilliant. And I hope everybody's making notes as to who they're going to go and look up a bit more about.
Yeah, I mean, it's every single person.
A vivid insight into such a wide variety of stuff here.
And every person is deserving of their own show and their own book and their own movie, and the extraordinary variety of backgrounds and accomplishments is to be talked about. But we're into the Soviet Union now. We're getting there, folks. I hope you're enjoying it. Fantastic stuff.
Yes,
so Soviet Union,
their partisans 41 to 45. Outside of the French resistance, at least for me, I know a little bit more about the Soviet Union partisans. Mainly from movies, but at any rate, they did intelligence, sabotage, harassment, counteroffensives. Now they attacked the Germans and the Polish resistance. So that's just the way it was happening in World War II. So next slide. Zoya. She was actually 18. She looks younger in this photo, and she may be a little younger in this photo. She was a student in Moscow, and she volunteered in October of 1941 for a partisan unit, and she's sent to the Western Front to fight, and she's captured in 41 while on a mission to burn a Russian village controlled by Germans. And I put that in there so people who aren't more familiar with war, that's the kind of decisions that have to be made, is you have to go burn down a town that's in your own country because the opposition is there. And that's just what you have to do. Now once she's captured, she is interrogated. The Germans try to get information out of her. She's burned and beaten. She refused to give up any of the names of her comrades, and she is hung. Some of her last words, there's several lists of her last words. One of them is she says, "You hang me now, but I'm not alone. There are 200 million of us. You can't hang us all. They will avenge me." Yeah. So these young women are pissed off. This is a lot of anger, and she's had it. So they do document her death. Next slide.
And I say everyone's going to know this photo. This is one of those classic photos, I think, that we're all familiar with. I'm glad you had the photo of her. I'll go back to it for a second. This young woman vibe. Look at those eyes there. There's that determination again we saw on the face earlier. You're not going to mess with her. She piss her off, and she's gonna get you. That one there.
And then the Germans, as we know, documented everything within the war paradigm. This isn't a sanctioned execution. She was an enemy combatant. Don't want to confuse the two. The Germans were guilty of plenty of murder, but within this is a legal execution. I don't know why they had to take photos of it, but that's just they document things well.
Well, I guess they're doing it as a form of deterrent. They're doing it to show the photos saying, if you resist us, this is what happens to you. The argument could be made that all you do is instill motivation in others to revenge the person. It's like the bombing of cities, that the people are still debating whether or not bombing a city of civilians breaks the will of the people in the city or hardens the will. It's still something that's debated, and I guess there are different explanations of when it works and when it doesn't work. But that's what I guess it's talking about.
Right? Yeah, I can't read what is on her, around her neck.
No, it's hard to see there. But we'll move on. So another figure here, Zinaida.
Yeah. Miss Portnova. She was 14 when she was staying at her grandmother's house in Belarus, and the Germans came to her grandmother's town. They beat her grandmother, and Miss Portnova was like, I'm not going to take this, and she joins up the local resistance group, and she starts out handing out leaflets, and then she's promoted to the combat section, and she's involved in ambush and sabotage. One of the most famous actions she commits is she infiltrates a German unit as a kitchen aide, and she poisoned hundreds. She poisoned them. I'm not sure if any of them lost their lives, but they got quite sick. And when she didn't turn up the next day, they started getting suspicious, and they finally caught up to her and captured in 1943. She had an escape attempt. There's several different stories, but in the escape attempt, she killed several Germans. One of the stories is the German interrogating her wasn't thinking or something, and he put his pistol down on the table. She grabbed it and shot two and took off. She got recaptured. They finally executed her, shot her, and dumped her in the woods. This link here takes you to a little clip about her. Again, these stories are better known. I don't know how well known, but better known in Russia, and but important for all of us to discuss. Yeah. So she was only 17 when she's killed.
Yeah, no, definitely. And we'll go to finishing with the United States. And I'm glad we're looking at this by nationality, because I think, again, you've both made the point that British authors tend to write about British agents and British experience, French write about the French heroes, and so on and so forth. And it's good to have a kind of a global vision of this and look at the differences between these women, and also the similarities. The defiance is obviously a recurring factor, and the determination, but the background and the motivations are extremely different. But the United States, we're finishing with your own. No problems with pronunciations now, JoAnna. You're on a home run now.
Yeah. Well, the OSS, better known Office of Strategic Service, Donovan was the head of the OSS. OSS is basically the precursor of the CIA. Basically, they are involved in espionage behind enemy lines, and they're helping with the military branches. They deal with propaganda, subversion, and then they helped out with post-war planning. So next slide. Kate, if you want to talk about Virginia Hall, she was a special mention. My parents wanted me to mention her. So since she's at SOE.
She is. So she started life wanting to be a diplomat, I believe. Had a shooting accident whilst in Turkey, whereby she shot off the lower half of one of her legs, which would have ended her diplomatic career and almost ended her life. She got terrible gangrene. But in a roundabout way, in a nutshell, she was recruited into Special Operations Executive, working because of her American neutrality, working in the Vichy, in Vichy itself, actually, in the town. And it was only when America entered the war that she had to be shifted out. She could no longer rely on it, and she came out across the Pyrenees. My favorite quote about her, as you say, her leg was nicknamed Cuthbert, and as she was coming into Spain, she sent a message saying, you know, kind of arrived safely, but Cuthbert giving me bother. And some unwitting bloke in SOE sent her a message saying, if Cuthbert bothers you, have him eliminated. To which she was like, that's my leg. She wanted to continue work for SOE F section, go back into France. Buckmaster, who was the head of F section, wouldn't let her. And she actually wrote, it's my neck. If I want to get a crick in it, I damn well will. But he wouldn't let her back. So I love it. She sort of flicked the proverbial V and went off and joined OSS instead, and went back into France, disguised as an old lady this time because she was too well known. And as you say, survived and became a founding member of CIA. It's one of my heroines. She's amazing.
And has that unique, well, not completely unique, but having had I was going to say a leg in both camps, but that's a really bad pun. I mean, it's all about someone. If it wasn't live, I'd go and edit that out. But SOE and OSS, and as you said earlier, and from the diplomatic background, she really did have experience in all those fields there. So looms large in all history of the whole spying world, I guess. A hugely influential figure. Yeah. Right. One more spy, and then another figure that JoAnna wanted to bring in. So let's talk about Maria.
She was a school teacher in Slovakia, and she spoke 5 languages: Slovak, Hungarian, German, Russian, and English. And she worked with the Russian military intelligence initially. She's finally recruited by the OSS as a translator and radio operator. And she helped gather intelligence, which the fact that she spoke 5 languages, I'm impressed. But that is such an important skill set that you find a lot of, well, our Green Berets now, they have language skills. So, and you know, the CIA, I'm sure that's a big prerequisite. Those aren't easy languages, and so that it was obvious, or is, you know, the OSS picks her up, and then she's able to help translate. So the last slide is a special mention.
Hang on, there we go. Yep.
She's Julia McWilliams. She's one of my favorites. Now, here in America, I've heard people refer to her as a spy, and I wanted just to go back to our definitions. So I'll skip down to who we know her as, Julia Child. At the time, she was Julia McWilliams. She was not a spy. She was not going out looking for information. She worked for the OSS as a research assistant typist, and she wanted out of there. It was boring. And so she went to work with the OSS on a shark repellent. And this was because sharks were getting curious and then nibbling on the mines and then blowing themselves up in the entire minefield. So she helped work with coming up with a formula to try to repel the sharks. So it's important. Definitions are important, and that's not to say her job wasn't important. It was very important. You need the mines in a wartime setting, and she helped keep those. And she also, after the war, became a pioneer for women in the culinary field, which is a common theme with the women who did survive. They become pioneers for women in other fields.
Did the shark repellent work?
I don't know.
They
didn't have any sharks to interview.
Oh, damn it.
Yeah.
Something out of Agent Carter.
Yes. So we'll have to
you made a really interesting point about these women getting confused as spies. I get asked nearly every day about my granny must have been in SOE because she was very secretive and she spoke French. And I have to go, oh, you know what? They're actually all, we know who they all are within SOE at least. But and one of the things I'm currently looking into myself, there were 3,000 women who were on the SOE register, and 50, 60, 70 of those were active agents. So, you know, these other people still have such a valuable contribution, but it's that fine line, isn't it, of, you know, they must all have been spies, but
well, it's like the working at
parachutes, you know.
It's like the working at Bletchley Park and being a code breaker. There are many, many more roles at Bletchley Park than just figuring out codes. But the association is now, if you're there, you must have been a best mates with Alan Turing, and you're there every day breaking codes. And of course, we just said the work is much more varied. And some people are just simply data analysts or data collectors and storers and file clerks, essentially we would call it there. But they're all part of the job there. But you touched on something there, JoAnna, that I want to end with. We will bring the show to an end, but the thing you came up with there is this idea about them being pioneers. You know, in your work, Kate, and your work, JoAnna, you know, you are working in, it has to be said, a male-dominated field. Military history, war history is dominated by people like me, middle-aged white guys. These women who were doing their stuff in World War II, their role as pioneers, in a sense, includes as roles for you two to do what you're doing now, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much so. Yes, I'm a bit. Yes.
No, I mean, I just want to talk about your feelings about, you know, about it's not just what they did in the war. It's just that if there's a single thing that connects these women, is it some kind of wanting to change the world attitude? Is it wanting to make a difference? You know, in both of your works, is there something you could put your finger on that would say that would unite these women?
For me, it was fighting for the greater good, for freedom, for the world that they wanted to exist in. A lot of the women I've written about at the end of the war just went back to their normal lives. That's what they'd been fighting for, the right to have a normal life. And for some of them, it might seem mundane to us in the 21st century, but they got married, they had children, they were housewives, and that's what they wanted. One of them said, you know, I want to secure a better world for my children. I don't think they were setting out to be pioneers. I don't think they were setting out to say, we can do it just as well as the men. You do get a bit of it in some of the, you know, the biographies. Anne-Marie Walters jokes about parachuting training, you know, being as scared, the men were as scared as she was, type thing. But I don't think that was the rub. I think they just wanted to do a job, and they were capable of doing it. The fact we now look at them as pioneers and heroines and role models is something very different.
And I think, again, I'd like to get JoAnna have her comment, but I think looking at their stories today collectively is a good way at looking about the combined achievements they had, because they may not, some of the women we talked about may not have felt that their contribution on its own was making a difference. But when you add it all together, it's the analogy of the factory worker putting a rivet in something that's going to be part of the wing of a Spitfire, whatever it would be. It's all part of the process, part of the chain. But the same question to you, JoAnna, about women in history and whether you think these women have a uniting or common factor. Is there anything you think you've identified?
I think they saw each had a different opportunity to use I go back to their skills and interests and what they were good at. And so once they saw the opportunity to use their skills, and to help fight against whatever they were fighting against, they took the opportunity. I mean, with my military history interest, I've been interested since I was 10. But I mean, the fact that it's not a big field for women, I don't think about that, because it's just always been. I mean, we consider ourselves students of military history. That's how men and the military historians I've met. Dr. Luvas was my first mentor. He worked at the War College here in Carlisle, up in Pennsylvania. And he signed one of his books to me, to a fellow student of military history. And I was 19 at the time, and that made a huge difference, because military history is just like history in other subjects. It's about humans involved in a crisis. So
yeah.
But the women in the wartime, they saw their opportunity to make a difference within their small area, and none of them looked back that I saw. They went for it. Some paid the ultimate price. It's interesting. The communist countries were the ones who paid the price. They had what? Russia lost 25 million.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
China
we're going down a massive rabbit hole. One of the things I've often said in Normandy is that you could argue that the only country that won World War II was the USA, in that you came out of it a superpower with a massive industry and all that thriving you had in the 50s. Britain, we're economically broken. Most of Europe is in ruins. East Europe has communism for another 3-4 decades. The Far East has many problems that we can't go into. They're leading to other wars. The Middle East has numerous problems leading to other wars. A lot of us watching today from America, Britain, Australia, we came out on the victorious side, but whether or not we actually won the war is another debate for another day. But anyway, Dr. Kate Vigors, Dr. JoAnna McDonald, it's been a fantastic conversation. We've been around the globe twice. I feel like I've traveled quite a few thousand miles today. My virtual air miles are up. Kate, you'll be back on with us next week. We can elaborate on this. We haven't come up with an exact name for the show yet, but we're going to be going through the weeds of historiography and SOE and continuing this conversation and welcoming some more comments from the viewers. JoAnna, you're probably going to come back at some point and do a deeper dive on OSS for us at some point, aren't you? I think we said that.
Yes, the Jedburghs,
however you want to pronounce it, whichever country. But that's fantastic stuff. But folks, Scott Grimwood, regular World War II TV viewer, is making his debut as a presenter tomorrow when we're talking about Dusko Popov, another interesting figure, double agent, and involved in D-Day. That will be a fantastic presentation. I will see you all then. But it's been a long one. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, JoAnna. Thank everybody for watching. I will see you all again tomorrow. Kate will be rejoining me for the show with Natalia Holt, and with joining me whatever day that is.
I've got my own talk tomorrow. Sorry,
she's got another engagement.
Sorry, I double booked.
No problem. Okay, thanks everybody. See you all tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.